Diane Whitfield spent 11 years building a logistics company out of a spare bedroom and a used laptop. She raised her daughter Margaret alone through all of it, working nights, missing recitals, promising herself it would all be worth it someday. When she finally let herself fall in love again, she believed she had earned a second chance at happiness. She had no idea she had just handed her life to the man who would destroy it. Caleb Whitfield was charming in the way that made people forget to ask questions. He complimented Diane's ambition instead of resenting it. He remembered small details, the name of her childhood dog, the anniversary of her father's death, the way she took her coffee. Within a year, they were married. Within 2, his name was on half of everything she owned. Margaret was 20 when her mother remarried. She liked Caleb well enough at first, the way anyone likes a stepfather who is easy to talk to and doesn't try too hard. It was small things that shifted. The way he remembered her class schedule without being told. The way he showed up to pick her up from work when her mother was too busy. The way he looked at her a beat too long when he thought no one noticed. By the time Margaret turned 22, she had convinced herself what she felt for him was real. She told herself it wasn't wrong because he made her feel wanted in a way she couldn't name. She never once considered that every warm word, every lingering glance had been placed there on purpose. Caleb had been planning his exit for 3 years. Vanessa Cole, Diane's closest friend since college, had been his lover for almost as long. They had one obstacle standing between them and everything Diane owned, and her name was Diane. Faking his own death solved that problem entirely, but only if someone else took the blame, and only if that someone had a motive the courts would believe without question. Margaret's infatuation was not an accident. Caleb had cultivated it slowly, deliberately, the same way he cultivated every relationship that served him. A pawn does not need to know it is being moved. It only needs to believe it is choosing its own path. The night everything began, Diane came home early from a business trip to find Caleb's car in the driveway and Margaret's bedroom door closed. She heard voices, low and careful, the kind of conversation people have when they don't want to be overheard. She stood in the hallway for a long moment before she knocked. Caleb opened the door first, too fast, already explaining before she asked anything. He said Margaret had been upset about a breakup, and he was simply checking on her. Diane wanted to believe him. She had built her entire second chance at love around believing him. 2 weeks later, Caleb didn't come home. His phone went straight to voicemail. His car was found abandoned near the river, driver's door open, a jacket she recognized folded neatly on the passenger seat. There was blood on the steering wheel. Not enough to suggest he had bled out, but enough to suggest a struggle. The police came to Diane's office 3 days later. They had a witness. Margaret sat across from the detective and told them, in a voice that shook but did not waver, that she had heard her mother threaten Caleb the week before he disappeared. She said her mother had found out about a private conversation between her and Caleb and had accused him of things he never did. She said her mother had a temper when she felt betrayed. Every word Margaret spoke was true. She simply did not know the conversation had been staged for her to overhear, or that the argument Diane had with Caleb that night had been engineered days in advance by Caleb himself, timed perfectly to give Margaret exactly the story he needed her to tell. Diane was arrested 2 days after that. The charge was murder. In the holding cell, waiting for her first hearing, Diane kept replaying the last normal morning she remembered, Caleb kissing her forehead before work, telling her he loved her, asking what she wanted for dinner. She could not reconcile that man with the one the prosecution described, and she could not understand why her own daughter would not look at her in the courtroom. Margaret told herself she was protecting Caleb because she loved him. She told herself her mother had gone too far, said something unforgivable, and deserved whatever came next. She had convinced herself so completely that she never stopped to ask the one question that would have unraveled everything. Why had Caleb needed her, specifically, to overhear that argument at all? Diane's attorney, Renee Marsh, was assigned the case 2 weeks before trial, inheriting a file that already looked hopeless. The evidence was circumstantial but damning, an eyewitness with a clear motive to lie for the victim, a blood trail with no body. a history of documented marital tension that Caleb himself had quietly fed to two of Diane's co-workers in the months before his disappearance. Renee did not believe in cases that were as simple as they looked. She requested the household security footage first, the one piece of evidence that could either confirm or dismantle the timeline the prosecution had built. When she arrived at the house to collect it, the footage from the 2 weeks surrounding Caleb's disappearance was gone. Not corrupted, not misplaced. Deleted cleanly by someone who knew exactly which files to remove and exactly when to remove them. Margaret swore she hadn't touched the system. She looked genuinely confused when Renee asked her about it, confused in a way that told Renee this was not a woman covering her own tracks. Someone else had been in that house, someone with the password and the motive and the time to do it quietly. Renee began looking at everyone who had access. Diane, Margaret, Caleb, obviously, though he was supposedly dead. And one more name that kept surfacing in phone records and financial statements Renee had subpoenaed almost as an afterthought. Derek Cole, Vanessa's brother, listed as a paid consultant on 3 of Caleb's business ventures despite no consulting firm existing under his name. Derek had been Caleb's closest friend for over a decade. He was the only person outside of Vanessa who knew the full plan from the beginning, and he was the one who had wiped the footage the morning after Renee first requested it, arriving before she did, letting himself in with a key Caleb had given him years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. While Diane awaited trial, Vanessa visited her in jail, playing the role of grieving best friend so convincingly that Diane clung to her as her only remaining source of comfort. Vanessa held her hand through the glass and told her she believed her, that she would do anything to help, that Diane was not alone. Every visit was a performance, and every word Diane confided in her was relayed back to Caleb within the hour. Caleb, in the meantime, was living 40 minutes away in a rented house under a false name, waiting for the trial to conclude, waiting for Margaret to sign the documents that would transfer what remained of Diane's estate into trust for her. Documents Caleb fully intended to have altered the moment Diane was sentenced and out of the way permanently. He did not love Margaret. He had never loved her. She was simply the most efficient tool available, young enough to be malleable, isolated enough to crave the attention he offered, and close enough to Diane to make her testimony devastating in exactly the way he needed. The morning of the final hearing, Renee received a message from a contact she had quietly cultivated inside the county morgue. Caleb's body had never actually been received. His name was in the intake log, but no corpse matching his description had ever passed through their doors. Someone had paid an attendant to falsify the record weeks earlier, and that attendant, faced with the threat of losing his job and his license, was finally willing to talk. Renee arrived at the courthouse late, evidence in hand, just as the judge was preparing to proceed without defense counsel present. The courtroom fell into a hush that felt almost physical when Renee Marsh walked in, files under her arm, apologizing for her lateness in a voice that did not match the calm authority in her eyes. The prosecutor objected immediately, arguing that the defense had already exhausted its allowances for delay. The judge, unconvinced by the objection but visibly curious about what Renee was holding, allowed her to proceed. Renee laid it out piece by piece. The falsified morgue intake record, the attendant's signed confession, the deleted security footage, later partially recovered from a cloud backup Caleb hadn't known existed, showing Derek Cole entering the house alone the morning after the disappearance and leaving 20 minutes later. Financial records showing regular transfers between Caleb's shell accounts and Vanessa Cole going back 3 years, well before his supposed death. And finally, a rental agreement, signed under a false name that matched Caleb's handwriting exactly, for a property 40 minutes outside the city. The prosecutor asked, visibly shaken, what any of this had to do with the murder charge against Diane Whitfield. Renee answered simply, there was no murder. Caleb Whitfield was alive. The gallery erupted. The judge called for order twice before the room settled enough for Renee to continue. She explained the plan as she had pieced it together, a faked death designed to frame Diane for murder, remove her permanently from her own company and estate, and clear the way for Caleb and Vanessa to disappear together once Margaret, manipulated into believing she was protecting the man she loved, had signed over what remained. Margaret sat in the second row, her hands shaking, her face draining of color as every sentence confirmed what some quiet part of her had refused to let herself consider. She had convinced herself for months that Caleb loved her, that her mother's arrest was simply a painful but necessary consequence of a jealous woman's temper. She had never once imagined she was the mechanism, not the reason. The judge ordered an immediate recess to allow law enforcement to act on the new evidence. Within hours, Caleb was located at the rented property Renee had identified, Vanessa with him, both attempting to leave the country on tickets purchased under names that matched neither of them legally. Derek was arrested separately, at the small apartment he had been using to avoid exactly this outcome. Diane was released that same evening, walking out of the courthouse into air that felt unfamiliar after months behind bars. Margaret was waiting outside, alone, having been told she was free to go while the investigation into her own involvement continued. She did not approach her mother. She simply stood at a distance, uncertain whether she still had the right to. Diane looked at her daughter for a long moment. She thought about every visit Margaret had failed to make while she sat in a cell awaiting trial. She thought about the courtroom, and the silence, and the way her daughter's testimony had been the single piece of evidence that made everything else believable. She also thought about the girl who used to fall asleep in her lap during long drives, who used to bring her coffee on hard mornings without being asked. Margaret spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she was sorry, that she hadn't known, that she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand how she had let herself become someone's weapon against her own mother. Diane did not answer right away. She had learned, over the last several months, that forgiveness and consequence were not the same thing, and that she was allowed to hold both at once. In the weeks that followed, the case against Caleb, Vanessa, and Derek moved quickly, aided by the sheer volume of evidence Renee had assembled. Caleb was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice, among a list of other charges that would keep him occupied in court for the better part of a year. Vanessa's role as his accomplice, and the discovery of a life insurance policy taken out on Caleb only months before his staged death, made her position even more precarious than his. Derek's confession, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, closed the remaining gaps in the timeline entirely. Margaret was not charged. The prosecution accepted, in the end, that she had been deliberately and systematically manipulated, her testimony shaped by a man who had spent years learning exactly what she needed to hear in order to believe it. That did not undo the damage. It simply meant the law would not punish her for it. She would have to find her own way to live with what she had done, knowingly or not. It took months before Diane and Margaret could sit in the same room without the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on both of them. It took longer still before Diane could look at her daughter without seeing. For just a moment, the courtroom and the silence, and the year she nearly lost everything. They rebuilt slowly, the way people do when trust has been broken by someone who understood exactly how to use it as a weapon. Diane went back to the company she had built from nothing, smaller now, some of it lost to legal fees, and the slow bleed of a year spent fighting for her freedom, but still hers. Margaret went back to school, choosing, finally, a path that had nothing to do with anyone else's plans for her. Neither of them ever fully forgot what it cost them to learn that the people closest to you can sometimes be the ones most willing to use you, or that love, when it is real, does not require you to destroy the people who raised you in order to prove it. Diane rebuilt her company from the wreckage. Margaret rebuilt her sense of who she was without a man's approval defining it. And somewhere in a courtroom miles away, Caleb Whitfield sat waiting for a verdict of his own, finally facing the one thing he had never planned for: consequences. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.